Howdy folks, welcome back to War Thunder Ground Forces with the mighty Jingles. Today we're going to be taking a look at what is arguably the tank that won World War II, the Soviet T-34. Certainly the most mass-produced tank in history, and for very good reason. This was a world beater when it was first introduced. It was quite simply the best tank in the world. And when Germany invaded Russia in Operation Barbarossa, they had a very, very nasty surprise waiting for them when they ran into tanks like the KV-1 and the T-34. This is the 1941 version of the T-34, featuring an improved 76mm gun, as well as a host of other modifications, and in this simulator battle, it's being driven by Swee Mattisson. At the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the vast majority of Soviet tank forces consisted of either the BT series of fast cavalry tanks or the slow T-26 infantry tanks, both of which were based on foreign designs. The BT series of tanks were based on a design by Walter Christie from the USA, and the T-26 was essentially almost a straightforward copy of the Vickers 6-ton light tank. Now, both the T-26 and the BT series of tanks were very well armed. The 45mm main gun that they both used was one of the, well, if not the heaviest caliber of weapon mounted in a tank of any nation at the time. The problem with the tanks was the armour. It was terrible. It wasn't just the thickness of the armour, although the thickness of the armour was bad and easily penetrated by low caliber 37mm anti-tank guns and even handheld anti-tank rifles, but the quality of the construction of the armour was pretty diabolical as well. It was all riveted, not welded, so an explosive shot that hit the tank and didn't penetrate the armour could still break off the ends of the rivets and send them flying around at lethal speeds inside the tank. Also, the quality of the construction was pretty bad, which led to gaps between the joints where the armour plates were riveted together, so a handheld Molotov cocktail could actually leak into the tank and set the fuel tanks and engine on fire. Even before Soviet tank forces were taking a beating at the hands of the Japanese in the 1939 battles of Khalkhin Gol, one Soviet engineer by the name of Mikhail Koshkin was convinced that he could design something better. This was going to be the A-20. The A-20 featured the same formidable 45mm gun as was already in use on Soviet tanks, but it featured a number of improvements, not least of which was the much more reliable V12 diesel engine, which was far less likely to burst into flames than the petroleum engines which were used on existing Soviet tanks. The revolutionary feature on the A-20, of course, was the armour. Not only was it heavier than the armour on the T-26 and the BT tanks, it was 20mm thick, hence the name A-20, but it was sloped, and it was welded, not riveted. After the disastrous border wars with the Japanese, Koshkin saw his opportunity and approached Stalin with the idea of building a second prototype, designated the A-32. It would have heavier armour, 32mm, the same engine, and a more powerful 76.2mm gun. Field tests showed that despite being heavier, the A-32 was just as mobile as the A-20. Convinced that he could do even better, Koshkin petitioned Stalin to let him develop yet another prototype with an even better 76.2mm gun, wider tracts for enhanced mobility on rough ground, and the same engine, but this time with 45mm of sloped armour. This was the T-34, and it was the sloped armour of the T-34 that was the key to its success as a battle tank. It's difficult to overestimate just exactly how revolutionary and important to the whole design process of making this tank work that sloped armour was. Generally, when you're developing a new tank, you always have to make a compromise in one area, whether that be firepower, protection, or mobility. If you beef up the armour, that makes the tank heavier, which reduces the mobility. If you increase the firepower, put a bigger gun in, well, bigger gun requires a bigger turret. Bigger turret requires a bigger turret ring, and a bigger turret ring requires a bigger hull. The weight goes up, the mobility goes down. Compare the T-34 to the Tiger. The Tiger was a great tank, but it wasn't particularly imaginative. It had 100mm of armour at the front, but that armour was flat. The Tiger was just a big box with a turret and a gun on top. It was a superbly engineered but very boxy and very unimaginative design, and all of that thick armour meant that it weighed a lot, anything like 60 tons of tank. The T-34 by comparison was a very light tank, half the weight of the Tiger, while still retaining very, very strong armour protection, because while it only had 45mm of actual thickness on its armour, that armour was angled at 45 degrees all around, which actually gave it effectively something like 60mm of armour protection from any angle, while keeping the weight down, and this was vitally important, because it meant that the T-34 didn't have to compromise on armour, firepower or mobility. It was actually better than its predecessors in all three areas. And keeping the weight of a tank down has additional benefits above and beyond just simply allowing it to maintain the same kind of mobility as its predecessors. You can cross ground that heavier tanks can't cross. You can use bridges that heavier tanks can't cross. And the reduced weight means less wear and tear on the drivetrain and the suspension. It makes it a more reliable tank. It means you don't have to design more complicated drivetrains, transmissions and suspensions in order to get the thing to actually work, the way that German engineers had to do with the Tiger. It makes it easier to manufacture and produce the tank in greater numbers. And so, in the T-34, Soviet Russia had a tank that not only was cheap, reliable, able to be manufactured in large numbers, but it was a generation ahead of anything that the Germans had in the field. It came as a huge shock to the Wehrmacht when they invaded Russia in 1941. German generals Guderian and von Kleist said that this was the deadliest tank in the world. Contrary to popular belief, early German tank design wasn't actually that good. The kind of early Panzer IVs, Panzer IIIs and Panzer 38Ts that were going into battle against the T-34 had a really hard time penetrating this tank's armour. And yet, Russia lost heavily in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, and they didn't lose because they didn't have any good tanks. The KV-1 could practically only be defeated by the German 88mm flat gun forced into the anti-tank role. The T-34 could battle practically with impunity the existing German tank designs. How the hell did Germany manage to win so heavily in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa? Well, once again, it was down to superior tactics. And one other little thing that German tanks had in vast numbers that Russian tanks didn't: radios. In a Russian tank company, only the command tank would have a radio. All of the other tanks in the company would have to communicate between themselves and with the tank company commander by using signal flags. You can imagine how well that worked out in the heat of battle when shells and bullets were flying all around. German tanks, on the other hand, were all fitted with radios. Good radios. This meant that the German tanks were actually able to use effective tactics in ways that Soviet tanks just couldn't. The biggest deficiency in the design of the T-34 was the size of the turret. The turret was only big enough to accommodate two crew, the commander and the gunner. This meant that the commander not only had to try to direct the crew of the tank and maintain communication via signal flag with all of the other tanks around him and the tank company commander, he also had to load the gun. Just try to imagine for a second what it must have been like to be the commander of a T-34 tank in 1941, engaged in battle with the German army. You're inside a buttoned-up tank. It's noisy, it's hot, the very limited visibility. You're having to keep the gun loaded, you're having to try to find targets for your gunner, telling him what to shoot at next. You're trying to direct the driver, and at the same time, you have to keep one eye on your command tank, if you even know where it is, in the smoke and confusion of battle, and trying to interpret whatever signals he is trying to give. It was really no wonder that German tanks were able to so comprehensively beat the Russians in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa through the simple fact that their tanks had radios, and their tank commanders, in the large part in most German tanks, were exactly that. They were just tank commanders. They weren't also loaders. They didn't have to take over machine gunner duties. The tank commanders in German tanks were there to direct the rest of the crew and coordinate between all of the other tanks in the tank company. It was a much easier job for a German tank commander, and because they had radios, they were able to effectively coordinate the tactics of all the tanks in the tank company in the middle of battle. Of course, the Russians weren't fools. They knew that it was very difficult for them to adapt their tactics in the middle of battle, so they attempted to compensate for it by comprehensively briefing their tank crews on what to expect before the battle. But if the situation changed in the middle of the fight, it was very difficult to execute anything but the most basic of tactics in a Soviet tank company. Imagine a Soviet tank company engaging a platoon of Stugs to the front, when suddenly a group of Panzer IVs appears on the left flank. The commanders of each individual tank are trying to keep one eye on the command tank for signals. If the command tank doesn't notice the threat to the flank, the entire tank company doesn't notice the threat to the flank. In a German tank platoon, any one tank was always able to communicate with any other tank clearly and instantly, no matter what was going on around them. And it was superior tactics, via the use of the radios that were fitted in all the German tanks, and the fact that the tank commanders didn't have to do anything other than command the tanks, which allowed the Germans, despite having inferior machines, to so comprehensively beat the Russians in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. At an astronomical cost in men and material, Soviet Russia learned the hard way that simply having a better tank wasn't enough. You had to actually be able to exploit the advantages of that tank and use it effectively in battle. And so the second version of the T-34, produced in 1941, which you can see here, featured not only an improved F-34 higher velocity 76.2mm gun, but every tank had a radio. Of equal importance, the Russians also kept a very, very tight rein on the production process of the T-34. Between 1941 and 1944, no modifications were permitted to the design and production of this tank, with the exception of fitting the 85mm gun in an improved turret. Other than that, not one modification was approved for the design and production of the T-34 unless it made the production of the tank cheaper or faster. There were none of these harebrained mad scientist schemes constantly being thrown into the development mix that often slows down the design and production of other tanks. They had a good tank and they needed more of them now. They didn't need a slightly better tank 6 months from now. Between 1941 and 1943, production time of a T-34 was cut by 50% and the cost was lowered from 269,500 rubles to 135,000 rubles. All of this despite the fact that the experienced engineers working in the factories had all been sent to the front to fight in T-34s, and that by 1943 the actual factory workers building these tanks were women, old men and children with no engineering training. The T-34 wasn't just a great tank, and it was a great tank, but it was something more than that to Soviet Russia. It was an expression of the Russian people's defiance and unity in the face of Nazi invasion. And it thoroughly deserves its place in the history books, not just as a great war-winning tank, but as an example of what a unified society can achieve in the face of adversity. As always, folks, take care, and I'll catch you next time.